Brian Carter drove his SUV through the serene streets of a quiet suburban neighborhood, still energized by a successful seminar he had just attended. As a committed middle school science teacher, he valued these chances to improve his teaching methods. The digital clock on his dashboard displayed 4:30 p.m. earlier than usual, a rare opportunity that often meant surprising his kids with spontaneous trips for ice cream. Pulling into the driveway of the modest two-story house he shared with his wife, Laura, and their 2 children, Brian noticed a quick movement behind the living room curtains. He chuckled, imagining his kids eagerly waiting for him to arrive. He picked up his briefcase filled with fresh ideas and resources, eager to introduce them in the classroom. Just as he reached for the front door with his keys, Brian paused. Laura's voice floated from the partially open living room window, her words causing him to frown slightly. "Listen, Michelle," Laura said, unaware of Brian's presence, "once he's done covering the kids' school expenses, I'm moving forward with the separation. After that, I'll accuse him of wrongdoing to ensure I get custody and support, while living with Alex and the kids." Brian's hand stopped midair on the doorknob, and his world seemed to shift suddenly as the weight of the situation hit him. His jaw tightened as anger surged momentarily, urging him to storm in and confront her. But Brian was not one for hasty decisions. He steadied his breathing, controlling his emotions. His usually lesson-focused mind now spun with a different strategy. Silently, he backed away and returned to his car. He started the engine and drove to nearby Greenwood Park, a quiet spot frequented only by a few joggers and dog walkers at this hour. Brian sat on a vacant bench by the pond, watching his reflection break into ripples on the water's surface. His usually steady hands, accustomed to writing notes and grading papers, shook slightly as he pulled out his phone. Hesitating briefly, he scrolled past Laura's name and selected Rebecca Collins, attorney at law. As the phone rang, Brian's mind raced with plans, evidence collection, financial protection, and ensuring the kids' well-being. "Collins' law office," a voice answered. "This is Brian Carter," he said calmly. "I need an urgent appointment with Rebecca regarding a divorce." After a short pause, the receptionist responded, "Ms. Collins can see you tomorrow at 7 a.m. Does that work?" "Yes, that's fine, thank you," Brian replied, ending the call. As Brian noticed a couple walking hand in hand along the pond, he wondered whether he and Laura had ever been that carefree, or if it had all been an illusion. Straightening up, Brian felt a shift from shock to determination. He returned to his car with a firm resolve. He would not allow Laura to dismantle his life's work. By the time he reached home, the sun was setting. He paused briefly to gather himself before stepping inside. The sound of cartoons greeted him as he entered. "Daddy," his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, exclaimed, running towards him with bouncing pigtails. He lifted her up, inhaling the familiar scent of her apple-scented shampoo. "Hey, princess," he said warmly, keeping his voice steady. "How was your day?" As Lily excitedly shared stories about kindergarten, Brian's eyes met Laura's across the room. She greeted him with a smile, appearing every bit the loving wife. "Welcome back, honey," she said, giving him a quick peck on the cheek. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour." Brian forced a smile. "Sounds good. I'll just freshen up." As he climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his mind was already busy planning. He needed to maintain the facade of an unsuspecting spouse for now. Over the following weeks, Brian kept up the appearance of a happy home, complete with morning smiles, casual conversations, and bedtime stories for the kids. But beneath this act, he was diligently preparing. Late one night, after Laura had gone to bed, Brian installed hidden cameras in key spots around the house. His hands were steady this time, and his actions deliberate. He placed cameras in the living room, kitchen, and home office, ensuring coverage of crucial areas. His thoughts drifted back to his meeting with Rebecca Collins, the assertive attorney who had praised his cautious approach. "We need undeniable evidence," Rebecca had advised. "Record everything discreetly, and don't let her sense anything is off." Brian had agreed, focusing on gathering financial documents as he promised. Now, with the last camera in place, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Laura mentioned over breakfast the next day, "I have an important client meeting later, so I might be back late." Brian simply nodded, sipping his coffee. "Good luck. I hope it goes well," he replied calmly. As Laura left, giving Brian a goodbye kiss with her usual smile. He wondered how many of her so-called late meetings had really been secret meetups with Alex. That afternoon, instead of going to work, Brian parked his car a block away from their home. Watching intently as a flashy sports car pulled into their driveway, Alex Whitaker, looking every bit the confident real estate agent in his tailored suit, stepped out and made his way to the front door. Brian's grip tightened on the steering wheel as Laura opened the door and pulled Alex inside with a cheerful laugh. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that every moment was being captured by the hidden cameras he had set up. Inside, unaware of the recording devices, Laura and Alex settled comfortably on the living room couch. Alex poured 2 glasses of Brian's favorite wine, a gift from a student's parent. "Soon, everything will be sorted," Alex said, taking a sip. "Brian won't expect a thing." Laura smiled back. "He's too trusting to suspect anything. This is almost too simple." Alex pulled her closer. "And soon, we'll be able to move on. No more pretending, no more sneaking around." Laura's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "I can't wait," she said. "Sometimes it's exhausting listening to his stories about school and science experiments." "Well, you won't have to worry about that much longer," Alex reassured her. "We'll make sure things work out for us." That night, as Brian reviewed the footage, he clenched his fists but kept his voice steady when he called Rebecca. "I have more footage for you to review," he said. The next day, Brian met with Rebecca at her office and handed her a USB drive containing the evidence. "Good job, Brian," Rebecca said. "This, along with the documents you've collected, strengthens your case. But keep gathering more. The stronger our position, the better." Brian nodded. "I understand. I'll keep you informed." As he left the office, Brian felt a mix of emotions, frustration at Laura's actions, but also a sense of resolve. He was taking control of the situation and was determined to handle things effectively. As Brian continued building his case, a new challenge appeared at work. The school board announced an emergency meeting to discuss potential budget reductions, which included the science department. Brian sat in the staff room, surrounded by concerned colleagues. The atmosphere was tense, filled with quiet conversations. "They can't just cut the whole department," said Karen, the chemistry teacher, worriedly. "What about the students?" Mike, who taught biology, shook his head. "You know how it goes. When budgets are tight, science is often one of the first to be reduced." Brian listened, already forming a plan. He stood up and addressed the group. "We're not giving up without making our case," he said. "We need to show the board, the parents, and the community why science education is crucial." "Who's with me?" After a pause, Karen spoke up. "What do you suggest, Brian?" Brian smiled, determined. "We're going to organize." Over the next few days, Brian worked tirelessly to save the science department. He mobilized his colleagues, rallied supportive parents, and prepared a strong presentation for the upcoming board meeting. His evenings, which had been filled with quiet frustration, were now filled with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as Brian reviewed budget reports in his home office, Laura came in and leaned against the desk. "Why are you spending so much time on this?" she asked, sounding both annoyed and puzzled. "It's not that important." Brian held back his frustration. "It's important to me, Laura," he replied calmly. Laura rolled her eyes. "Just remember, we have dinner with the Mitchells on Friday. Be there on time." As she left, Brian turned back to his work, focused on keeping up appearances for now. On Friday evening, Brian hosted the Mitchells as planned. He played the role of a gracious host, pouring wine and engaging in conversation. His smile never faltered, even when Alex arrived unexpectedly during dinner. "Hope you don't mind me joining," Alex said cheerfully. "I was in the area." Brian noticed the quick exchange of glances between Alex and Laura but kept his composure. "The more, the merrier," he replied. As the evening went on, Brian noted the subtle interactions between Laura and Alex, mentally recording each one. "So, Brian, Mr. Mitchell asked, I heard there are some budget issues at your school?" Brian nodded. "Yes, but we're working on a plan to show why the science department is essential." Alex laughed lightly. "Seems like a lot of effort for a subject that many students find difficult." "That may be true," Brian replied calmly. "But understanding science is key to shaping the future. It's more than just memorizing facts." Laura interjected, her tone dismissive. "Let's not bore everyone with work talk, dear. Who wants dessert?" Laura called cheerfully, bustling off to the kitchen. As she left, Brian caught Alex's gaze. For a moment, he wondered whether Alex saw him as a rival or just an obstacle to overcome. Regardless, Brian knew he was more than ready for whatever lay ahead. Later that night, after the guests had left and Laura had gone to bed, Brian sat alone in his study. He pulled out a small notebook and jotted down the evening's observations. Then, opening his laptop, he began typing an email to Rebecca. "Another productive week," he wrote. "I think we're nearly ready to make our move." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the starry sky. A storm was coming, but this time, he intended to be the one in control. Closing his laptop, Brian's thoughts shifted to the upcoming school board meeting. He now faced two battles, one at home and one at work. But he was determined to win both. He wouldn't let Laura destroy his family, and he wouldn't allow misguided administrators to dismantle his passion for teaching. With newfound determination, Brian began reviewing his notes for the board presentation. He had always taught his students about historical figures who overcame immense challenges. Now, it was his turn to embody that strength and resilience. As the night deepened, Brian worked tirelessly, his mind clear and focused. He wasn't just fighting for his job or his marriage, he was fighting for his future, his children, and the principles he believed in. He was ready for whatever lay ahead. Brian Carter stood at the podium, surveying the crowded auditorium filled with school board members, parents, and fellow teachers. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to concern. This was the defining moment for the science department, and possibly his career. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, fighting to preserve the past while his own future was uncertain. But unlike his personal struggles, this was a battle he could fight openly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, concerned parents, and colleagues," Brian began, his voice steady and clear. "We're here to discuss more than just budget cuts. We're here to determine the importance we place on understanding the world around us." As Brian delivered his well-prepared presentation, he noticed the board members leaning forward, visibly engaged. He presented compelling statistics, shared heartfelt testimonials from students, and painted a vivid picture of the consequences of ignoring science education. Cutting the science department, Brian concluded passionately, is not just about losing classes. It's about losing our children's connection to understanding the natural world, their ability to innovate, and their potential to solve the problems of tomorrow. I urge you to reconsider this decision. The room erupted in applause as Brian stepped away from the podium. He noticed several board members nodding in approval, while parents exchanged animated discussions. As the meeting adjourned, the superintendent approached Brian with a smile. "That was quite a speech, Mr. Carter. You've given us a lot to think about." Brian nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "Thank you, sir. I just hope it was enough." It wasn't until he was driving home that the impact of the evening truly hit him. He had done it. Not only had he saved the science department, but he had also earned a promotion to department head. A sense of triumph surged through him, momentarily pushing aside the turmoil of his personal life. As he pulled into the driveway, Brian noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the sleek sports car. It was Alex Whitaker's. Inside, he found Laura and Alex in the living room, speaking quietly and laughing together. They quickly pulled apart when Brian entered, a flash of guilt crossing Laura's face before she replaced it with a bright smile. "Brian, you're home early. Alex just stopped by to drop off some paperwork for a real estate deal we're working on." Brian raised an eyebrow, his voice calm. "Is that so? How convenient that he arrived just as I was due home." Alex stood, smoothing his suit. "Hey there, Brian. Hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. You know how it is in our field, always on the go." Brian's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Not at all, Alex. Always a pleasure." As Alex made his excuses and left, Brian turned to Laura. "I have some news. The board meeting went well. They're not only keeping the science department, but they've also promoted me to department head." Laura's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, well, congratulations, I suppose." Brian watched her closely, noting the lack of enthusiasm in her voice. "Thanks. I thought we could celebrate. Maybe open that bottle of champagne we've been saving?" Laura's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. Of course, darling. Let me just freshen up first. As she headed upstairs, Brian allowed himself a small smile. He had noticed the flicker of panic in her eyes, the quick glance at her phone. No doubt she was already texting Alex, changing whatever plans they had made for the evening. Brian moved to the kitchen, taking out the champagne and 2 flutes. As he popped the cork, he wondered how many more of these false celebrations he would have to endure before finally exposing the truth. The next morning, Brian got up early, his mind already focused on the day ahead. He had a meeting with Rebecca scheduled for lunch, and he knew today would be critical in moving their plans forward. As he brewed coffee, Laura shuffled into the kitchen, looking tired. My head is pounding. I think that champagne hit me hard last night. Brian handed her a mug, his tone concerned. Here, this should help. You seemed pretty out of it last night. I was worried you might be getting sick. Laura mumbled a thank you, avoiding his gaze as she sipped the coffee. Brian noticed the faint smudge of lipstick at the corner of her mouth, a shade he knew she didn't own. I've got a busy day ahead, Brian said casually. Meetings all afternoon. Don't wait up for dinner. Laura nodded, a hint of relief in her posture. That's fine. I've got a late meeting myself. I'll probably grab something with the team. As Brian left for work, he allowed himself a small, bitter smile. He knew exactly what kind of team meeting Laura had planned. The day was a blur of classes and administrative tasks. At lunch, Brian met Rebecca at a discreet cafe across town. The sharp attorney listened carefully as Brian updated her on the latest developments. Well done, Brian, Rebecca said with approval. You've built a strong case. I think it's time we take action. Are you ready? Brian's eyes hardened. More than ready. What's the next step? Rebecca outlined their strategy, her voice low and precise. By the time lunch was over, Brian felt a surge of satisfaction. The net was closing in, and neither Laura nor Alex had any idea. That afternoon, Brian set the plan in motion. He transferred funds from their joint accounts to a secure one in his name, canceled shared credit cards, and notified the children's school that only he was authorized to make educational decisions. As he drove home that evening, Brian's phone buzzed with a text from Laura. Cards declined. What's going on? He ignored it, knowing she would be home soon, demanding answers. It was time for the confrontation he had been planning for weeks. Brian was in his study when he heard the front door slam, followed by Laura's angry footsteps. What is going on, Brian? She demanded, her face flushed with anger. Why are our cards not working? Why can't I access our accounts? Brian looked up calmly, his expression unreadable. I think you know why, Laura. Or should I ask Alex? Maybe he can explain it to you. The color drained from Laura's face. What are you talking about? Drop the act, Brian said, his voice cold but controlled. I know everything. The affair, your plans to separate, and the false claims you intended to make. Did you really think I was that naive? Laura's shock quickly turned to anger. How dare you? She shouted. You had no right to spy on me. No right? Brian stood, his frustration finally surfacing. You're my wife. Did you forget that between your secret meetings with Alex? He pulled out a folder, slamming it on the desk. Here's everything, recordings, photos, financial records showing your hidden account. It's over, Laura. Your plan has failed. Laura's eyes darted between the folder and Brian's face, realization dawning. You've ruined everything, she hissed. No, Laura. You did that yourself, Brian replied, his voice steady. I've already consulted an attorney. You'll be hearing from her soon. You might find your own lawyer. As Laura stormed out, shouting threats and insults, Brian sank back into his chair. The confrontation he had dreaded for weeks was over, but he knew it was only the start of a long, difficult battle. The following days were filled with tension. Brian moved into the guest room, minimizing contact with Laura. She swung between angry outbursts and attempts to manipulate him, but Brian remained firm. One evening, as he was helping the kids with homework, he received a text from an unknown number. You think you've won? This isn't over. Brian deleted the message without a second thought. He had expected Alex to retaliate eventually. Let them scheme. He was prepared for anything they might try. What he wasn't ready for, however, was just how far Laura and Alex would go to try and salvage their plan. It started with whispers at work, colleagues giving Brian odd looks, hushed conversations that abruptly stopped when he entered the room. Then came the meeting with the principal. "Brian, I'm going to be direct," Principal Harriet Dawson said, her expression serious. "We've received some troubling information about you. There are allegations of financial misconduct." Brian's mind raced. Of course, it was Laura and Alex trying to frame him for misusing funds. "What kind of allegations?" he asked, striving to keep his voice steady. Principal Dawson slid a file across the desk. "These records suggest you've been misusing the science department's budget. Given your recent promotion, this is a serious accusation." Brian reviewed the documents, feeling a surge of anger with each page. The forgeries were skillful. If he hadn't anticipated something like this, he might have been caught off guard. "These records are false," Brian stated firmly, meeting the principal's gaze. "I can prove it. Give me 24 hours and I'll provide evidence that not only clears my name but also reveals who's really behind this." Principal Dawson hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Brian, you've always been an exemplary teacher. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But if you can't disprove these allegations—" "I understand," Brian replied, standing. "Thank you for the opportunity." As he left the office, Brian's mind was already working out his next move. He had kept meticulous records of the school's finances since becoming department head, and now it was time to put that diligence to good use. That night, as Laura slept, Brian worked tirelessly, compiling financial documents, cross-referencing budgets, and preparing a comprehensive report that not only exonerated him but also raised serious questions about who had access to the school's financial systems. The next morning, Brian presented his findings to Principal Dawson and the school board. The evidence was irrefutable. Not only was Brian innocent, but the attempt to frame him pointed to someone with insider knowledge of the school's operations. "This is remarkable," one board member remarked, looking up from the report. "Mr. Carter, we owe you an apology. It seems we also have a major security breach to investigate." As the meeting adjourned, Brian felt a tremendous weight lift from his shoulders. He had won this round, but he knew the war wasn't over. Returning home that evening, Brian found Laura pacing in the living room, her face a mask of barely contained rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she spat as soon as he entered. "How dare you accuse me of trying to frame you?" Brian regarded her coolly. "I didn't accuse you of anything, Laura. But it's interesting that you immediately assume I'm talking about you. Guilty conscience?" Laura's face twisted with fury. "You'll pay for this, Brian. I swear. I'll ruin you." As she stormed out of the room, Brian sank into a chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He picked up his phone and dialed Rebecca's number. "It's done," he said when she answered. "They tried to frame me for embezzlement, but I managed to clear my name." "What's our next move?" Rebecca's voice was determined. "Well done, Brian. Now we go on the offensive. It's time to file for divorce and bring all our evidence to court." As Brian ended the call, he glanced at the family photos on the mantle. So much had changed in such a short time, but as he looked at his children's smiling faces, he knew that every battle, every sleepless night, and every moment of pain was worth it. He would protect them, no matter the cost. The storm that had been building for weeks had finally broken, but Brian Carter was no longer just enduring it, he was now directing it. The courthouse loomed ahead, a symbol of justice where Brian's marriage would soon face its reckoning. He straightened his tie, a gesture of habit rather than vanity, and ascended the stone steps. Rebecca Collins, his relentless divorce attorney, walked beside him, her briefcase brimming with evidence against Laura. As they pushed through the heavy oak doors, Brian spotted Laura and her lawyer in a hushed conversation. Laura's eyes, once warm with false affection, now burned with a mix of fear and hostility. Brian met her gaze without flinching, his jaw set in determination. "Let me do the talking," Rebecca whispered. "You've done your part. Now let the evidence speak for itself." Brian nodded and took his seat at the plaintiff's table. The judge, a stern woman with salt and pepper hair, called the court to order. "In the matter of Carter versus Carter," she announced, "we will now hear opening statements." Rebecca rose confidently. "Your Honor, what we have before us today is not simply a case of marital discord. This is a case of calculated betrayal, conspiracy, and attempted fraud." As Rebecca laid out the case, Brian watched the judge's expression shift from neutral to barely concealed disapproval. Exhibits were presented, bank records revealing Laura's hidden accounts, transcripts of incriminating conversations, and photos of her interactions with Alex. Laura's lawyer, a young man who appeared increasingly overwhelmed, tried to object multiple times, but each objection was swiftly overruled. As the evidence mounted, Laura's composure began to crumble. The case was clear, her schemes exposed, and the courtroom bore witness to the unraveling of her plan. Brian could see the panic growing in Laura's eyes as the mountain of evidence against her mounted. When it came time for the defense to present their case, Laura's lawyer stumbled through a weak argument about misunderstandings and marital stress. It was clear he knew they were fighting a losing battle. Then, in a desperate move, Laura herself requested to address the court. The judge, eyebrow raised, allowed it. Laura approached the stand, her face a mask of practiced vulnerability. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling with well-rehearsed emotion. "I know I've made mistakes, but I'm the victim here. Brian, he's not the man you see before you today. Behind closed doors, he's controlling, manipulative. He's mistreated me for years, emotionally and otherwise." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Brian's hands clenched beneath the table, but his face remained impassive. He had anticipated this move. "Objection, Your Honor," Rebecca said, rising smoothly. "This is the first time any such allegation has been raised, and we have evidence that directly contradicts Mrs. Carter's claims." The judge nodded. "Proceed, counselor." Rebecca approached the bench, producing a USB drive. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit G. These are video recordings from the Carter's home, installed by my client out of concern for his and his children's safety when he first became aware of Mrs. Carter's unfaithfulness and plans to deceive him." As the footage played on the courtroom's monitor, Laura's face paled. The video showed not Brian, but Laura herself engaging in emotionally harmful behavior, yelling at Brian, manipulating their children, even throwing objects in fits of rage. "As you can see, Your Honor," Rebecca continued, her voice icy, "the only mistreatment in this household came from Mrs. Carter herself." The judge's expression hardened as she turned to Laura. "Mrs. Carter, making false accusations is a serious matter. Do you wish to retract your statement?" Laura, her composure crumbling, could only nod silently. The rest of the proceedings passed in a blur. When the judge finally delivered her ruling, her voice rang with unmistakable disapproval for Laura's actions. "In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, this court grants Mr. Carter's petition for divorce on grounds of infidelity and mental cruelty. Furthermore, Mr. Carter is granted full custody of the children, with Mrs. Carter to pay alimony and child support." As the gavel fell, Brian felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned to Rebecca, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Rebecca nodded, a rare smile appearing. "You did the hard work, Brian. I just presented the facts. Now, let's get you and your children home." As they left the courtroom, Brian caught sight of Laura slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, he felt a twinge of, not regret, but perhaps pity. Then he remembered the coldness in her eyes as she had plotted against him, and the feeling passed. Brian stepped out into the sunlight, ready to start the next chapter of his life. The weeks following the divorce were a whirlwind of change. Brian found himself navigating a new reality, one where he was both mother and father to his children, where whispers followed him in the grocery store, and where his phone buzzed constantly with messages of support and the occasional angry text from Laura. One sunny Saturday morning, as Brian was helping his daughter Lily with her science project, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find Cynthia, Laura's sister, standing on his porch. Her face was drawn, eyes red-rimmed from what looked like days of crying. "Brian," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know where else to go. Can we talk?" Brian hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the half-finished science project a colorful barrier between them. "I'm so sorry," Cynthia blurted out, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I had no idea. Laura told me you were the one. God, I feel so foolish." Brian pushed a box of tissues toward her. "You weren't the only one she deceived, Cynthia." Cynthia dabbed at her eyes. "When I heard that call, I thought she was confiding in me about your supposed mistreatment. I never imagined she was the one plotting and deceiving. Brian, if I had known, you would have told me?" Brian finished for her, his tone not unkind but skeptical. Cynthia's shoulders slumped. I don't know. I'd like to think I would have, but she's my sister. Was my sister, she corrected herself. After what she's done, I can't. I just can't. Brian nodded, understanding all too well the pain of severing ties with someone you thought you knew. What will you do now? He asked. I'm not sure, Cynthia admitted, but I couldn't go on without apologizing to you. Without you knowing that I never meant to be part of her deception. As Cynthia left, Brian felt a strange mix of emotions. The apology didn't undo the pain of the past months, but it was a step toward healing, a reminder that not everyone in his life had been false. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Brian sat in his study, staring at the blank document on his computer screen. The cursor blinked steadily, like an electronic heartbeat waiting for words. Almost without conscious thought, Brian began to type. He wrote about betrayal, about the shock of discovering that the person you thought you knew best was actually a stranger. He wrote about the strength it took to stand up for oneself, to protect not just your possessions, but your very sense of self. As the words flowed, Brian realized he was doing more than just venting. He was creating a roadmap, a guide for others who might find themselves in similar situations. By the time he finally looked up, the first rays of dawn were peeking through his window. The next day, Brian reached out to a few of his colleagues who had gone through divorces. They met for coffee, sharing stories and advice. As they talked, an idea began to form in Brian's mind. What if, he said slowly, we started a support group? For men who've experienced what we have, false accusations, manipulation, everything. The others nodded enthusiastically, and within weeks, the group became a reality. They met at the community center, a growing circle of men finding strength in shared experiences and mutual support. It was after one of these meetings that Brian received an unexpected call. Laura's name flashed on his phone screen, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. Against his better judgment, he answered. Brian? Laura's voice was small, almost unrecognizable. I need to talk to you. Please. Brian's grip tightened on the phone. I think we've said all we need to say to each other, Laura. Please, she begged. I've lost everything, my job, my friends. Even Cynthia won't speak to me. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? Brian cut her off, his voice cold. You didn't make mistakes, Laura. You made choices, deliberate, calculated choices to ruin me and take everything I cared about. Now you're dealing with the consequences of those choices. But I've changed, Laura pleaded. I've realized how wrong I was. If you could just give me another chance. No, Brian said firmly. You made your choice, Laura. Now live with it. As he ended the call, Brian felt a sense of finality. The last tie to his old life had been severed, and he was ready to fully embrace the new. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Brian thrived in his role as department head, his innovative teaching methods gaining attention from educators across the state. But it was as a single father that he found the most fulfillment. One crisp autumn morning, Brian stood before his class, the familiar thrill of sharing knowledge buzzing through him. But today's lesson was different. Today, he wasn't just teaching history, he was teaching life. Today, he began, his voice carrying to the back of the classroom, we're going to talk about resilience. About facing adversity and coming out stronger on the other side. The students leaned forward, intrigued. Many of them knew bits and pieces of Brian's story. It was hard to keep secrets in a small town, but they had never heard him speak of it directly. Throughout history, Brian continued. We see examples of individuals and societies overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds. The American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But resilience isn't just for the history books. It's a quality we can all cultivate in our daily lives. As Brian spoke, weaving historical examples with personal stories, he could see the impact his words were having. Students who usually struggled to stay engaged were alert, attentive. Those dealing with their own challenges sat up straighter, hope kindling in their eyes. Remember, Brian concluded, adversity doesn't define you. How you respond to it does. You are all capable of incredible strength and resilience. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. As the bell rang and students filed out, many lingered to thank Brian. Some even sharing their own stories of overcoming obstacles. Brian felt warmth in his chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond teaching dates and facts. Later that afternoon, as Brian was packing up to leave, there was a knock at his classroom door. He looked up to see a woman in a smart business suit, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Blackwood from Pinnacle Publishing. Do you have a moment to talk?" Intrigued, Brian invited her in. Sarah took a seat, her posture radiating enthusiasm. "I'll get straight to the point, Mr. Carter," she said. "Word of your story has been spreading, and not just in this town. Your resilience, your fight for justice, your work with the support group, it's inspiring. We believe your experience could help many people if it were shared more widely." Brian leaned back in his chair, surprised. "Are you suggesting?" Sarah nodded. "We'd like to offer you a book deal, Mr. Carter. Your story and your words. What do you say?" For a moment, Brian was speechless. Then, slowly, he nodded. "If it helps even one person avoid what I went through, it's worth sharing." As Sarah left, promising to send over a contract, Brian sat at his desk, a bit dazed by this unexpected turn of events. His phone buzzed with a text from the babysitter, reminding him it was time to pick up the kids. Brian gathered his things, a smile playing on his lips. Life had thrown him challenges, but he had not only survived, he had thrived. As he walked to his car, he saw his children waiting, their faces lighting up at his approach. Lily waved excitedly, while his son David held up a drawing he'd made in art class. Brian felt a surge of love and gratitude. Despite everything, he had emerged stronger, wiser, and still capable of love. He had turned his pain into a force for good, helping others while building a better life for himself and his children. As they drove home, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues. Brian glanced in the rearview mirror at his children, his heart full. They were chattering happily, untouched by the shadows of the past. Brian smiled, knowing that while the road had been difficult, it had brought them to this moment. Driving toward a future filled with hope and new possibilities. The betrayal that had once threatened to break him had instead become the catalyst for a richer, more genuine life. As they turned onto their street, Brian felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, with resilience, courage, and love. And so, our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I'll see you there.